Hey there, everyone. Welcome to the Weird Cities podcast. I'm John.
And I'm Rex.
We're going to discuss all the weird cities from classic sci-fi, fantasy, horror, and weird fiction. Today you're in for a real treat because it's all about the master city builders of Lovecraft's universe. Today we're going to be doing the Elder Things city from At the Mountains of Madness. So, Rex, what exactly is the Mountain of Madness, and what is the city there like?
The Mountains of Madness are a undiscovered place in Antarctica that an expedition is kind of happens upon in the process of doing some other research. And
it ends really well, doesn't it? With sunshine and rainbows and lollipops.
Yeah.
They find the remnants of a pre-human extraterrestrial civilization that built the city, and something nasty happened to the civilization, leaving a bunch of gibbering creatures called shoggoths to overrun the ruins, and the entire place just as essentially a multi-million-year-old ruin that's on a high plateau somewhere in Antarctica. Now, at the time, a lot of Antarctica was unexplored, so there was still empty spaces on the map. Aviation was also a new area that explorers were using to reach undiscovered parts of the world with. So the premise of like an empty city in Antarctica was semi-plausible, at least in Lovecraft's era. Interestingly, in the book, the fictional Miskatonic University sets up a private expedition to go down to Antarctica, but private Antarctic expeditions actually finished in the 1930s, and the story was written and set kind of in the early 30s, so the chronology works out well. But the city itself is fairly interesting, because at first, the main characters are doing an archaeological dig. They find some strange five-pointed stones, and they find members of this extraterrestrial civilization, which they call the Elder Things. They're essentially these barrel-shaped bodies with wings, 5 wings, tentacles, and eye spots. And they think they're dead at first, but they're not quite dead. They wake up, and it doesn't end well for part of the expedition. The remnants of the expedition explore deeper into the continent. They find this city that has like this black basalt kind of material that's used to construct buildings. Many of these buildings have like geometric shapes and are explicitly described as quinquangular or five-sided. That's a word I really like, quinquangular.
It's a good one.
I guess we can thank Clark Ashton Smith for that one. For the city itself, the Elder Thing biology is very different than human biology, and thus they have very different sociological, economic, and cultural necessities than humans did. For one, the Elder Things could survive underwater, they could survive on land, in thin atmosphere, and even in space if they had access to the right chemicals. So this drastically expanded environmental constraints compared with humans. Likewise, they weren't really bothered by the Antarctic temperatures all that much. When they lived millions of years ago, the continent was a little warmer than it is in the present. So at least they might have had that preference for warmer climates. Now, one of the interesting things about the Elder Things city is that a lot of the city, by the time the expedition stumbles upon it, is all kind of rotted away, but you get the impression that a lot of the superstructure of the buildings still remains after hundreds of millions of years. The main character kind of uncovers a lot of the history of the other ones, or at least interprets it by reading their artwork. Do you remember some of their history, Rex?
I seem to recall a lot of subjugation was going on.
Yeah. This is one of the, I guess you could say, less savory aspects of some of Lovecraft's stories. The whole idea of building civilization on others' backs. Lovecraft was a very snobby, racist guy, and there are echoes of that in this story, even though it's through the lens of speculative fiction. In this case, the Elder Things, they didn't want to do all the dirty work of actually building the city and such, so they built creatures called shoggoths. Now, a shoggoth is kind of like a blob monster. It can shapeshift. It's basically like a nanoblob, for lack of a better term. A utility blob that can do almost anything you program it to. It's construction equipment, recycling system perhaps, maybe dissolve things or rip things apart, as we find out the hard way. Let's say that for purposes of the podcast, we're assuming them to be some kind of biotech construction equipment, for lack of a better term. The shoggoths were instrumental to the Elder Things building their city. The Elder Things city, for instance, was built kind of slowly and deliberately because the Elder Things did not reproduce sexually. They used spores to reproduce, and they could live essentially almost indefinitely compared with humans. So there is very little basis for families to form compared with humans because they could afford to take a much longer term view because they could put themselves into stasis, they were fairly tough compared with humans. But what's really cool about the Elder Things is that of all the weird races in the mythos, they're actually presented semi-sympathetically by Lovecraft. Because there's one quote that I really like that goes something to these effects. After all, they were not the evil things of their kind. They were the men of another age and another order of being. Nature had played a hellish jest on them, as will any others that human madness, callousness, or cruelty may hereafter dig up in that hideously dead or sleeping polar waste. And this was their tragic homecoming. They had not even been savages, for indeed what had they done? That awful and frantic white simians with queer wrappings and paraphernalia, poor Lake, poor Gedney, and poor old ones, scientists to the last. What we had not done in their place. God, what intelligence and persistence. What facing of the incredible, just as those carving kinsmen and forebears had done, things only less incredible. Radiates, vegetables, monstrosities, star spawn, whatever they had been, they were men. So these things were constrained by time, they were constrained by space, they only could travel forward in time, regular organisms. They were made of carbon-based, as far as we can tell. They fought against a lot of the other races of Lovecraft's cosmology, like the Mi-Go, Cthulhu and friends, and at least fought them to a standstill. But there was one war they couldn't really win. That was when their Shoggoths, their construction equipment, start gaining intelligence and the ability to live on land. Now, when this starts happening, the Elder Things freak out and start fighting a war to resubjugate them. It seems to have worked, at least for a short term, but then things go to pot. The Elder Things retreat somewhere else, implied to be some kind of undersea city elsewhere, and they leave their main metropolis to go rot in the ice. So, it's upon this setting, millions of years later, that our explorers stumble upon. They're able to interpret some of what happened, but they're able to tell that this city is, very well planned out. The Elder Things, because they can live on land or on sea, there's a huge range of habitats they can live upon. And that's probably why they might have preferred the Shoggoths to stay in the water, because they could do their construction there, or do their industries offshore in a very literal sense, because an aqueous environment might have been a little easier for them to manage the Shoggoths in, whereas once they're on land, it's a little harder to potentially control what they've got access to in terms of materials. It also might have been harder to keep the Shoggoths from reproducing out of control. But the Shoggoths, essentially, they start becoming more intelligent and crudely mimicking their master's art and culture without really understanding it. From there on, the Elder Things, aside from maybe a few survivors that put themselves into stasis in the Antarctic ice, get wiped out by the Shoggoth uprising. Now, the explorers find the Elder Things, and they eventually run into a Shoggoth, which leaves one of them gibbering and insane. And it's also kind of implied that there might be something worse in or near the city as well. So, Lovecraft had a really cool escalation effect. What do you think, Rex?
Yeah.
Well, as far as the city itself goes, there might be some real-life basis or relation to it in the form of the biotechnology. The Elder Things were clearly masters of biotechnology and various biotech industries, because today, bioprotection or biosecurity, that is keeping unwanted microbes and invasive species out of certain countries, is a very big concern, because one thing might decimate crops or a key species that say fishermen might rely on or that local farmers rely upon. The Elder Things probably had this stuff all settled down, but they kind of got complacent by essentially using Shoggoths for everything as opposed to just old school industries. One issue, though, is that in real life, sometimes attempts to counter invasive species, they bring in a new species in, that new species becomes a pest, and so on. Kind of like a kudzu in a lot of the southern parts of the U.S., for instance, as well as various fish and plants and whatnot. But the Elder Things presumably had an economy that would be based on biotech, and as explicitly stated in the story, the Elder Things didn't really migrate or move all that much, except when they're trying to build a new colony or a new offshoot. So chances are maybe when their population reached a large enough number, a number of them would move out and start building up a new city or colony somewhere. One of the cool ideas of that is it basically becomes like civilization. Once your cities reach a certain population, you send out settlers to move elsewhere. Unlike humans, the Elder Things probably had a much longer-term view, we'll be able to support 10,000 new Elder Things over the next century, so might as well build a new district to the west or whatnot. Another cool aspect of the Elder Things is that they were masters of biotech, but even that was not enough to save them from the Shoggoths. During the Shoggoth War, presumably, they tried perhaps maybe plagues or using some kind of override mechanism or failsafe, but the Shoggoths perhaps adapted around that, because in real life agriculture, one problem with pesticides is that one batch of pesticides, once they use it, the bugs might develop an immunity to it, and they come back nastier next year, so you need to use something different. Kind of like the real-life scenario we have with bacteria and antibiotics. Use too much of an antibiotic and the germs become resistant to it. And it becomes harder and harder to invest in the research for more countermeasures. Like, that's why keep looking for new antibiotics costs a lot of money and research hours.
If they're used to moving and advancing slowly, they're probably also not going to be very quick on the uptake as far as that goes.
So they probably have like a much slower like industrial cycle or economy. It's mentioned in the story they probably have like a bureaucratic kind of government, unlike say a really fast capitalist economy or wartime socialist economy. So it's probably unlikely that they were able to switch into like total war production or anything by the time these Shoggoths come. So essentially it might have been like them getting caught off guard perhaps, or getting overconfident. So essentially it became like the Red Queen's race. You run faster to stay in the same place, and eventually they didn't have the resources to keep up with the Shoggoths, and it all went downhill from there. Now, as far as the city itself goes, this city is probably one of the most thoroughly described ones in weird fiction in general, because we have like the geography of the city.
We've got the measurements down.
Could you elaborate on that? Oh, one of the cool things is that we have specific measurements, we have the interiors of buildings, how they designed houses. The Elder Things, they designed some of their houses to be partially underwater, did they not? And there also was like a part of the city was half underwater, half above. They could fly around. So there's no mention of things like public transit or vehicles, is there not? Because the Elder Things can move in almost any medium, they probably didn't need buses or trains to get around. One of the cool things about one of Lovecraft's cities...
Are there mentions of walkways between the buildings?
Yes, there are.
Okay.
Presumably, though, the Elder Things could move using almost any set of limbs they felt like, so maybe some of the Elder Things preferred walking around as opposed to swimming or flying. Perhaps the walkways could have been for inclement weather or high winds, or maybe as something...
Presumably they wouldn't have existed below the sea.
Or perhaps under the sea, they would use that as some kind of secure corridor to keep unwanted interlopers out. But the Shoggoths could change shape, so they could fit through most of these corridors and such. But strangely, one of the questions that Mountains of Madness doesn't really address is, why haven't the Shoggoths taken over the rest of the world? It's implied that life on Earth came from like botched Elder Thing experiments that got loose and became the first like microbial and thus Earth-bound life. But one of the cool ideas is that why don't the Shoggoths just do like a Grey Goose scenario and keep replicating out of control till they take over the planet?
Yeah.
So one of the fan theories, I guess you could say, at least that Rex and I came up with, is that maybe there's some kind of pheromone or some kind of chemical coating that the Shoggoths would use to mark their territory or to communicate. They marked up, and they would use that to coordinate around the...
Sort of a biological Wi-Fi.
Exactly. And that's around the city. Maybe it's a remnant from their war with the Elder Things. And as a result of that, they don't really get annoyed unless someone starts intruding on their territory. There are some other things that inhabit the city that are touched on briefly, like there's these big-ass albino penguins that presumably are Shoggoth food, because those things were freaky. They're like 6 feet tall and completely white.
Yeah, I don't know if they were supposed to be a byproduct of Elder Thing experiments or what.
Yeah.
Or maybe just deformed by the influence of the area.
The area probably has like mutagens and toxic chemicals or stuff like that that's still left after all that time. If the Shoggoths are sitting around, who knows what other crap's floating around there.
Yeah.
Now, one of the cool parts of the Elder Thing city is that it has extreme durability in the face of some of the harshest environments known to man. It can take years and years for any degradation to occur, at least as far as our protagonist can tell. A modern city, by contrast, like the skyscrapers, require constant maintenance. So it would take like maybe a couple of centuries or so for skyscrapers to begin collapsing without regular maintenance. Whereas things like the pyramids and such might take a couple thousand years. But the Elder Thing city, that thing can last millions and millions of years with very little wear and tear, relatively speaking. There was collapsed corridors and such, but nowhere near as much as you might expect from, say, a collapsing human city.
Yeah, and we don't know how much of the ruin is a result of warfare as opposed to just natural decline.
We also don't really know how much of the city was even inhabited. Perhaps that parts of the city were gradually abandoned to the Shoggoths or quarantined as the war went poorly. Because there is a work, a fan sequel to Mountains of Madness that was written by Tim Curran that basically has like the Elder Things implied to have fled to an underwater city. Antarctica has a lot of subglacial lakes in it, the ones that have liquid water under the ice, heated by geothermal or other measures. And one of the biggest ones is called Lake Vostok, Vostok being the Russian word for east. And it's implied that perhaps down there could be like another Elder One city or something cool down there. I've never read the book, but it's next on the list. The Elder Thing city, in contrast to some of the other cities of Lovecraft, one of Lovecraft's main cities, of course, is Arkham, his fictional New England city.
Yeah.
That one is much more relatable, at least to a layman, because it's just a 1930s American city in New England, presumably based on Massachusetts or Connecticut, essentially the area near where he grew up.
Yeah.
Whereas the Elder One city, we have big proportions. It's like 25 miles wide.
Yeah, it's very detailed for something that's probably mostly out of his imagination. We speculated about the grid-like pattern coming from other New England towns that he would have known, but that's as far as we could kind of gauge just how he came up with this place.
If cities in New England, or at least human cities, would use like a grid-like pattern, the Elder Things kind of use pentagons and five-sided symbols, because it's implied that because of their 5 appendages and 5 eye spites, that number had a lot of significance to them, because these creatures had ceremonial burials that they conducted, essentially, with 5-sided, like, cairns, essentially, used to mark their fallen comrades. And they use, like, 5-sided little soapstones, potentially as some kind of currency or exchange unit. So these things had an economy, currency. As we mentioned earlier, they're one of the most relatable of Lovecraft's creatures. This is in contrast to another Lovecraftian race, the great race of Yith, that essentially hop between eras to steal minds. We'll cover the Yith in greater detail in another episode, but the Elder Things are cool because they're constrained by time, they're constrained by matter, they still need food. We don't really know how they ate the food, but one of the things that's kind of cool, or at least one theory that we came up with, is that early in the story, the scientists dig up like an old tunnel full of bones that's roughly from the same era of the Elder Thing city. It has like dinosaurs and things that are extinct. Maybe these creatures were grown for food by the Elder Things.
Or at least beasts of burden.
Beasts of burden, or used for other purposes as well, like maybe dinosaurs there or something.
Or they just kept them as pets.
Yeah, that kind of leads to another cool idea we had. Because if they're growing dinosaurs, right, that basically means that someone had to manage the livestock. Thus, there are Elder One cowboys that ride dinosaurs.
Yeah, I wonder how they'd wear those hats.
Yeah. Maybe one for each of their tentacles. What do you think?
Yeah.
One cool thing about Mountains of Madness, the story, is that one of the other members of the Weird Tales Circle, Clark Ashton Smith, wrote about a fictional era called the Hyperborean Cycle that was set in Greenland before it was covered by glaciers. And 2 of the cities there, Comorium and Ozuldarum, were presumably from at least 10,000 years before the present era. We still need to double-check some of the references here, but there is a line in Mountains of Madness where Lovecraft mentions explicitly that this metropolis, this Elder Thing city, predates like the Ozuldarum and Comorium by thousands of years. Because the Mythos guys loved just calling each other's references. And
yeah, they like to share everything and crib each other.
Yeah, because we got a couple mentions of like Dread Cthulhu and some of the other creatures of the Lovecraft mythos, like the Migo and the Star Spawn.
Yeah. Well, that's just him making a more cohesive idea of his own universe.
the name Elder Things, in fact, comes from Lovecraft's fictional tome of horror, the Necronomicon. Essentially, the sanity-rending tome that appears in just about every weird tale story and their imitators since then. But the Elder Things city...
It's most popularly seen in the Evil Dead franchise.
Yeah, there it's flying around and it bites your fingers.
Yeah. Remember, Fatu Barada Nikto.
Fatu Barada Nikto. This is my personal favorite of Lovecraft stories, is that you have a very good picture of the Elder Things, the rise and the fall of their city, but here, because humans are so out of place here, out of place in time, out of place in biology, out of place in psychology, the city is presented in the story as an object of, like, exotic horror. Because Lovecraft's common theme was that...
Lovecraft's theme is anything that's not New England is terrifying.
Exactly. But the more alien it is, the more terrifying it is, generally speaking.
Yeah.
The city itself and the Shoggoths are terrifying. The Elder Things are relatively human.
But only because they're, aristocratic estates and not, dirty laborers.
In true Lovecraftian snob fashion. But the city itself in the story is like something ancient and terrible, and the narrator, one of the sole survivors of the expedition, basically is trying to set the record straight on what really happened during that expedition.
Now, so here's another thing about how he turns something into horror. Even once he starts to make the protagonist relate to the Elder Things, he shifts the tone of horror to the Shoggoths, and he leaves it there, and that's, they're the servile race.
One of the other things, though, is that during this process, the fear of, like, uprisings of various laborers was very much in Lovecraft's mind, because this is the era of the first Red Scare,
yeah.
of violent labor strikes, and not to mention, Lovecraft, being the racist, was always fearful of, like, a non-white Anglo-Saxon Protestant
non-whites
group,
rising up,
or at least non-Anglo-Saxon whites, because in one of Lovecraft's other stories, Shadow over Innsmouth.
Yeah, he doesn't like them hill folk much either.
No, he does. Well, and remember, Lovecraft was freaked out enough to write Shadow over Innsmouth because he found out his grandmother was Welsh or something. So Lovecraft was a funny dude. But anyway, as far as the city goes, it's an example of, like, urban constraints that have nothing to do with humans, but still, the inhabitants are relatably enough in that they're constrained to one era. They're able to plan for long periods of time, and they still need food and labor, essentially, because unlike, say, the great race of Yith, which can hop back and forth between eras, the Elder Things, for the most part, they have to worry about attack from their enemies, they have to worry about securing food, they have to worry about labor and industry.
They just have to plan through whatever period they're in, like human beings.
Exactly. And they have a society that's bureaucratic, presumably meritocratic, so that means they might have a system of education, a system of perhaps law or protocol to follow, even though they might not have much of a basis of family because they reproduce through spores. They at least presumably have a lot of the institutions that would be vaguely familiar to a human.
Yeah, their means of main family units would have been more like some kind of old club.
Essentially, different ones declaring lineage from another. We're not quite sure whether they can reproduce asexually or not, but these creatures, presumably that enough of them, if they give them enough time, they could, perhaps even those poor survivors of the initial Shoggoth uprising, could repropagate the race in time. Sadly, that doesn't quite work out, based on how horribly First Contact goes awry. One of the other aspects of the Elder Things cities is that they got skyways, but they also have a lot of tunnels underneath. Now, some of these other tunnels underneath, they also have, like, underwater areas, as we mentioned earlier. One idea that might be really cool for these is that perhaps that they would have different microbiomes under the water or at different levels inside here, like terrariums of some kind, for growing different kinds of organisms or different types of simulated habitats.
Yeah, I could see them, doing massive fish farms under the sea.
Or maybe something more exotic, like a big blob of tissue, because that's essentially what a Shoggoth is, a big blob of protoplasm.
Yeah.
Now, one thing that might be really cool is like, essentially, a Shoggoth acts like a bunch of, essentially a utility blob. So, say they want some fish meat. Give this give the genetic code to a Shoggoth, have it spit out a big chunk of fish meat without the fish.
Do you think they would just actually create the Shoggoths and have them turn into whatever they need for sustenance?
Or perhaps produce it, because one of the...
like a replicator.
Essentially, a Shoggoth, at least as far as like my headcanon goes, would be like it's a kind of a nanobot construct, or not bio-nano construct, that's made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, which is the main building blocks of a lot of life on Earth. So, a Shoggoth could build like tissue, like a tissue 3D printer, or it could build maybe deal with inorganic materials like perhaps those that were used to build the city itself. Because even today there are companies and researchers that are using 3D printed buildings. Perhaps one of the ways that the Shoggoths were used as construction equipment is you tell a Shoggoth to move to a certain location, start depositing like a layer of cement or binding material, and gradually building it up like that, like a Lego set. And then you could maybe do this simultaneously and build different levels on top of each other, or connect them with walkways. A lot of the geometric shapes might be a result of like the city itself being designed like on paper or in a computer or simulation or whatever the Elder Things equivalent of that was.
Yeah, we don't know how they would have directed them, if it would have been through their weird tubes or like telepathically or what.
Well, however they did it, one relevant thing we might learn is that if we're going to design like 3D printed structures, we might not necessarily just be constrained to the regular boxes and rectangles we're used to. You might be able to grow or use organic shapes or geometric shapes that previous architecture did not take into account. And what's really cool, I think, is that maybe to build on some of our other ideas of like different levels under the city being used for different purposes, maybe you might have had like essentially, have you ever heard of a bioreactor? A bioreactor is essentially a system in chemical engineering that's used to turn one product into another by means of microbial or biological means. Now, maybe instead of just a sewage system, they had like a bioreactor combined with that. Essentially, it's something called bioremediation, where you would take waste and use microbes or engineered organisms to recycle it or to redirect some of that material for other purposes.
Sure.
That's used today for like to take down, pump out human waste from septic sewers and use it quite literally for things like fertilizer and phosphates.
Yeah.
But in the Elder Things case, maybe they had their waste, with their waste products, flushed through some kind of sewer down into the bowels of the city, where it would have been used for growing different kinds of organisms in a kind of a septic sewer / bioreactor / even agricultural context, if you really want to get a little icky. And the Shoggoths, because they're kind of a biological universal constructor, they might have been a key part of that process. But unfortunately for them, the Shoggoths were not content being sewage equipment. So you have an uprising of sewer-spawned abominations that would be the biggest thing outside of New Jersey. One of the other implications is that some people or some things might have taken up residence since this era long ago. Because one thing that's never really made clear in the book, but it's implied, is that there's this big hole the protagonists see when they're exploring the city. It's right before they encounter the Shoggoth, essentially. But something big and creepy might be living down there, and it's implied something worse might be living in or near the city.
The Shoggoth comes out of, right?
There's the hole, but there also is Danforth, one of the survivors. As they're flying away, he looks back over the mountains and he thinks he sees something worse.
Yeah, that's an entirely different aspect.
Yeah, but maybe that there was something that even drove what was left of the Elder Things, made them hightail out of there even faster.
Right. Yeah, it's supposed to be, that actually could be what kept the Shoggoths from continuing.
There's also the implication that whatever was down there might be stuck in the city, but perhaps whatever's controlling the Shoggoths, if there is anything, isn't quite aware of the outside world. Maybe this expedition blundered onto it, and maybe like one of the protagonists' like dire insights is that if they keep exploring down there, they'll find some cosmic horror that's going to wake up and destroy the world with Shoggoths if it becomes aware of more food sources outside.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that idea is almost definitely from the Arthur Gordon Pym story by Edgar Allan Poe.
Yeah, and Lovecraft was a big fan of the story because in that story they had a native tribe that would shout out Tekilili as their battle cry.
Yeah,
where,
this is also what the Shoggoths say when
yep.
they encounter.
One of the other legacies of Mountains of Madness, in addition to like the Call of Cthulhu role-playing games module, Beyond the Mountains of Madness, and various books, was also kind of unintentional on Lovecraft's part, or he would find it ironic. In the conspiracy theory community, there's the ancient astronaut theorists who have long hypothesized, in quotation marks, about lost alien cities under the ice of Antarctica. And this is the story that probably, or at least put that idea into public circulation back in the 30s. Now, one of the other big events, at least as far as the conspiracy circle goes, was back in the late 1940s, there was Operation High Jump by the U.S. Navy. Essentially, it was a U.S. Navy expedition to explore, like, Antarctica and set up a U.S. research base down there. But I remember seeing this like really cool piece of fan art. I'll link it in the show notes. It shows like a submarine from Operation High Jump in like an underwater dogfight with a Shoggoth. So like, if you really want to get like into like a Lovecraftian / Delta Green kind of conspiracy, Delta Green being an RPG that's like Call of Cthulhu crossed with X-Files, where the players are like U.S. military or government personnel fighting the mythos. Maybe like the idea for the Pentagon came from like explorers seeing the lost Elder Things city and deciding to mimic it. There's our discussion on the Elder Things city. So Rex, what are we going to be doing next time? Perhaps that root of all pulp.
Yeah, we're probably going to be getting into Comorium and Usuldarum by Clark Ashton Smith.
So we're going to be seeing a more identifiably human city, but one from a fantasy vision, more
intensely weird dude. So even the most normal aspects of it are going to be kind of off the wall.
Yeah, the idea of finding something ancient and alien, that still brings peril to the present. We saw that in a lot of the Dan O'Bannon movies, right? Like Alien,
yeah,
and recycled essentially for Prometheus.
Yeah.
Mountains of Madness continues to live on in pop culture.
I mean, the thing about it too is the Elder Things city is in a lot of ways just kind of a cousin to the whole Lost World or Lost City kind of idea.
Yeah, only in this time, the Lost City doesn't have any friendly locals, and like it doesn't have a beautiful princess to woo or anything like that. It just has Shoggoths and albino penguins and creepy frozen critters.
Yep. There's our Weird Cities talk about
the Elder Things city, and hope you'll join us next time for the Cities of Hyperborea.